Ayes are 61, noes are 60. The amended Part 1 will stand part. The question now is that Part 2 stand part. The debate on clauses 6 and 7.
Mr Chair.
Diane Fenton.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Well, I stand to take a call in Part 2, clauses 6 and 7 on the minimum wage starting out wage amendment bill. I just wanted to start with a comment, really, which has bemused me during this debate, which is how come increasing pay motivates bosses and CEOs, but cutting it is supposed to motivate young workers? How come? Now, I'd really like the Minister and the Chair to attempt to answer that, if he would, or at least a speaker from the other side, because I don't get it, and nor do the thousands of young workers that are affected by this bill. They see day in and day out huge salaries being paid to CEOs, huge amounts of compensation given to various people like the Solid Energy, Don Elder, 1.3 million, sitting on his couch at home doing nothing, and yet they're supposed to be feeling grateful because this government is cutting their pay. They're supposed to be buying into the narrative that we hear again and again from this government, that work is somehow a charitable act and that employers are offering a charity. Now, I found it astonishing, Mr Chair, that Mike Sabin could assert that employers would create a job for someone because they could pay them $11 an hour. If there is no job, no work to do, no work to be done, there is no job. They're not going to do it out of charity. But what we hear from the national government is workers and young workers should be grateful. They should be grateful for the opportunity. And even though they can be paid less for doing exactly the same work, and they can be sacked within 90 days with no reason given, why should young people be grateful? And they are, look, no, it's not actually. It's about treating young people, and it's about. Well, I mean, I'm looking forward to Mike Sabin getting on his feet and actually answering my first question about why is it okay to pay lots and lots of people, and some people, CEOs, large amounts of money, and that's supposed to motivate them, and that's the justification we hear, and young people are supposed to be motivated by this bill. Now, I have a couple of things I want to say about Part 2, Mr Chair. The first part, Part 6, and I just want to check with the Minister and the Chair that I'm right about this, but the way I read this is that it amends the Accident Compensation Act so that young workers will get 80% of 80%. Is that right? So they will get, instead of getting 80% of their adult minimum wage as they do under the current Act, unless they're on the 300 hours or 200 hours, they will get 80% of $10.80. So I want the Minister to look at that, because otherwise I don't see the point of that amendment. So what it seems to be saying is people, young workers that go on ACC, are going to have their pay cut even further. So they are into, we've already heard and we've already talked today about how young workers are going to be forced off invalids benefit and sickness benefit. Otherwise they'll be sanctioned, they'll be stood down from their benefit for 13 weeks, they'll be punished if they refuse to accept the job that Work and Income deems to be acceptable. And now what happens if they get injured on the job, and remember these are young workers going into often dangerous situations. It can be very dangerous in some of these jobs. They're worried about raising issues because they can be sacked in 90 days. They could have an accident and then they find themselves on $10.80 an hour. So what this bill, what this Part 2 does is reduce the pay for young workers even more if they're injured on the job. That is so unfair, and I would appreciate the Minister addressing that and explaining why the government thinks that's fair and young people should be forced to take another pay cut should they be injured on the job and have to go on ACC. I want to also address Clause 7, which is the transitional savings provisions in relation to the minimum new entrant rate. And again want to remind the House what the new entrant rate was. It is, in fact, what exists now, but will go out of existence on the 1st of May. What that was a young worker in their very first job a 16 or 17-year-old in their very first job, who could be paid 80% of the adult minimum wage for 3 months or 200 hours. On a one-off basis. So that was on the basis that they would learn the job within 3 months or 200 hours. And from then on, Mr Chair, and from then on, they would be paid the adult rate. Now, of course, what this bill does is remove that, and it says that 16 and 17-year-olds have to learn the job, and it takes them 6 months to learn the job, so they're on $11 an hour. And then they go to another job and they have to learn it all over again. So they go back to $11 an hour. They never get ahead while they're 16 and 17. That is so unfair. 16 and 17-year-olds, as we've heard in this debate, are often doing the same job as other workers. It is not about their output, their abilities, because if it was, the government would not be changing the existing provisions, which allows a training period for a worker in their very, very first job. What this does is punish 16 and 17-year-olds. It's not 6 months. It's 6 months again and again and again. And then if they happen to lose that job when they're 18 and go on to a social security benefit, well then, if they get a job, they can be punished again. So not only can they have youth rates, all the time during the period they're 16 and 17, but it carries on until they're 18 and 19. And Mr Chair, what I don't get about all of this is this lack of understanding from the government about how discriminatory this is, how unfair it is, that people doing the same job can be paid less because of their age. We have not had that kind of discrimination on the basis of gender, on the basis of race, on the basis of a whole range of other issues over the years, for many, many years, and they would be intolerable. We would not say to an older worker who is over 65, well, you're not as productive as that worker, so you're going to get paid 80%. That would be unacceptable, because there is discrimination rules about discriminating against older people and people on the basis of age. But somehow, because these are younger people, because they're working and contributing, they can be picked on by this government, they can be picked off by this government. And I go back to what I said at the beginning. For some reason, the national government thinks these workers are going to be grateful for this. Well, I can tell that national government they are not. And I have had many contacts. I don't know about Mike Sabin, who he talks to in his area. I was interested in Tracy Martin's contribution because she lives in the same area. So I was very interested in what she had to say about it. But I talk to a lot of young people. I'm in touch with the Same Work, Same Pay movement, who were out the front only a couple of months ago protesting about the fact that this bill discriminates against young people who are trying to get ahead, who are doing the same job. It is unfair, it's discriminatory, but worst of all, this is not going to make a damn bit of difference to youth unemployment. It is not going to help young people get a job. If there is no work, there is no job, and employers are not going to perform charitable acts by giving young people a chance because they can pay them less. That is so dopey. That is such a dopey notion, yet we've heard it again and again. Now, we all know there's a crisis in youth unemployment, and some of my colleagues have talked about Labor's solutions, Labor's ideas on that. I think I cannot fail to come to the conclusion, Mr Chair, that this bill demonstrates the absolute dearth of ideas from the National Party when it comes to dealing with our young people. And unfortunately, our young people are going to keep going on the plane to Australia, to better jobs, to a place where they get treated with respect. And David Bennett should probably just not say too much, given the speeches he made 3 years ago, actually saying he didn't support youth rates. David Bennett probably should keep quiet. And I Well, I'm looking forward to the member taking a call and actually explaining why he thinks he got it wrong then, and why he got it right and why he's wrong now. That would be very, very interesting. I was also quite fascinated too that John Banks did one of his very rare speeches in the House. You know, the ACT Party seems to get very excited when it comes to cutting young workers' pay. I remember Roger Douglas did it. And I remember saying, "Is this why you came to Parliament, Mr Douglas?" And it seems with Mr Banks that may be the case too. And all of those members in the government, I hope one day they can stand up and explain to young people why they think this bill is a good idea.
I call Sue Moroney.
Thank you, Mr Chair. In rising to speak to part 2 of this bill, I think we may be getting to the crux of what this bill might be about, because